So I'm just going to share a few stories from that first trip to Iraq now, and there's a bit of a theme to most of them, and then we'll have some discussion. We can talk about all sorts of things. One of the first lessons I had came very quickly to me in the first day, and the message is know your enemy. Know your enemy before you bomb them, because you might realise that they are more like you than you ever imagined. Before I went to Iraq, as I was packing my bag, I realised I didn't know anything about the place except what I'd heard through the media, and I was a fairly educated, well-informed person. So I thought, what do you know about this place? I know Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein. Because we do, don't we? We know who he is and what he's done. That was the story of Iraq that I knew. I also knew about the first Gulf War, because I was in America at the time and the place was crazy about it. And I knew about the sanctions because I'd heard about it through human rights groups. So those three things are all to do with maniacal psychopath dictator, wars, suffering, sanctions. And I also imagined Iraq as an Islamic fundamentalist country. Why? I don't know. Because there are connotations given in the media that it must be, if it's bad and it's like this, then it's fundamentalist. I didn't have a clue. So my conclusion was Iraq was a dark and sad place, full of suffering and shrouded women and frowning men, and nobody's having any fun. A sad place. So this is my stereotype. You know, we all have our stereotypes about countries overseas. So this was my stereotype. So when I got to Iraq, not only did I realise when my stereotype's not true, but to realise that the opposite was the case really shook me up. It was embarrassing. So my first couple of days around Baghdad, I learned a lot. And that is that, of course, it wasn't a fundamentalist country. It was secular and had been for a very long time because Saddam was secular and he didn't like that religious mob and they didn't like him. So most women were not, at one stage, not even allowed to wear hijab. So a very religious woman, this would be the most that you would see, a pretty little scarf on her head. Most Iraqi women would be dressed the same as we are now, although probably a bit more glamorous, because Iraqi women are beautiful. So are men. Physically beautiful. They're very proud of how they look, their appearance, and so they would dress up very nicely to go to the shops and get the eggs and the bread. So I'm talking stilettos and very, very fancy and very much made up. Very beautiful, very westernised, very sexy, basically. And so I felt like a real dag in my polar fleece and hiking boots. You couldn't really compete very well. And so Iraq was a place full of life, full of colour, full of fun. Baghdad was a city similar to Sydney, about 5 million people living in the city, so high-rise buildings, apartment blocks, shopping centres, soccer fields, universities, art galleries, nightclubs, cafes, churches. 10% of Baghdad was Christian. I didn't know to expect that. Why didn't I know to expect that? All these traditions living in harmony together. I said to a Muslim man once, because I noticed the churches and the mosque were beside each other and there was a lot of interaction going in between the two. They would both be caretakers for each other's buildings. I said to an Iraqi man, "Isn't it amazing," I said, "how the Muslims and Christians here get on so well, so close?" He looked at me and he said, "What a strange thing to say." He said, "Is it different where you come from?" At that point, there was a Sydney council in the northern suburbs that had refused a Muslim prayer hall around Pennant Hills area, something like that. And people were putting pig's eggs on steaks. And I said, yes, it is different where I came from. And he said, well, I don't know why, because we're people of the book. And they've done it for 1,500 years, and so it was not a big deal for them. Of course, all of this has changed now. But Iraq was a place that was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, a place of high culture. So we had poetry readings by the River Tigris. We had Shakespeare in the centre of town, where the National Theatre is the centrepiece of Baghdad. And we had open-air cafes with lots of beautiful Middle Eastern music. And then on one side you'd hear the Middle East music, on the other side you'd hear Britney Spears blaring out of the speakers. Not that that's a good thing. It's just how it was. Then you would have Metallica, and you'd have the heavy metal nightclub down there. You'd have the bottle shops on every second corner selling beer, wine and spirits. A feeling of quite a bit of freedom in your personal life. Highly educated. So at one point, Iraq had the highest rates of master's degrees and PhD degrees in the world. That was in the 70s. And I have my theory as to why that was the case. And that was, like many countries, there was compulsory army. So when men turned 18, they were required to join the army. So that was the rule in Iraq, except if you were enrolled at university. And so they just kept going and going and going. So people my age were on their second masters or going into their PhDs, young people. So highly educated. So that means Iraqis could speak to us in English. It was probably their third or fourth language. And they asked us about the latest Shakespeare we'd read and other great pieces of literature, invited us to their art galleries, and I felt like a cultural moron. Why didn't we know this? Why didn't we know? The children are amazing. They learnt English at school, so they'd come and tug on your clothes. Hello, miss, welcome in Baghdad, what's your name? And children are the focus of life in Iraq and probably in the Middle East. They are doted upon. The whole world revolves around children. Family is by far the most important thing. Everything's about family. And of course, we got to experience the wonderful tradition in the Middle East and Iraq, and that is of hospitality. Any of you who've been to the Middle East know what I'm talking about. It can be overwhelming. You'd be invited for tea in the morning to someone's house to drink tea. It's served in little tiny glasses without handles, and it's black and it has 5 sugars, generally. And there's lots of cake. And so you drink lots of tea and cake, and then you're sitting and talking to the family for a long time. This is a family you met on the street who said, please come to my house and meet my family and come and have tea with us. So we'd go and you'd drink tea, and a couple of hours would pass, and then lunch would come in. Lunch is being served, and we'd sit down and we'd eat lunch and enjoy the hospitality, and then the afternoon we'd have some coffee. By this stage the children are on your lap and the personal questions are starting. So how's your mother? Is she okay? Are you married? No? I have 5 cousins in the next one. I'll just give them a call now and we can have a meeting. And so we got to know each other. We got to hear about each other's lives. We got to do a lot of laughing. Iraqis have an amazing sense of humour. They're really great at joking around. And so then the sun's gone down and it's dinner time and we have a bit of supper, and the man of the house says, well, you can't go home now. You can't go back to your hotel now because it's dark and you shouldn't walk, and so you'll have to stay the night. And so we stay the night, and the next morning the man of the house will say to us, well, you consider yourself part of our family now. Call me uncle and auntie. And you know, the most amazing thing about this was that it was totally sincere. It's natural, and that's how it is. We used to call hospitality in Iraq, because it was so overwhelming, we called hospitality hostage-patality. Because when you went out and you said goodbye to your friends, you just didn't know when you were going to make it home. It was beautiful. But I must admit, on my first day, I didn't know what was going to happen when Iraqis met me and heard that I was Australian. Because by then, our former Prime Minister, remember him, John Howard, had put up his hand and said, I'm going to be the Deputy Sheriff. How embarrassing. And so he had said, we're joining this war. He's one of the first to commit to being part of the coalition of the willing. And so I realised that the Iraqis had been following the politics, the international politics, and they would be aware of this. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be very popular, am I? You know, they're probably going to have an issue they might want to challenge me with and ask me about this. And I was nervous. I was really nervous. I didn't know, I couldn't defend it. I didn't know really what to say. So walking down the street on the first day, there was a bunch of about 8 or 9 human shields walking together, exploring Baghdad, and we were stopped by a group of men. And the men looked at us and said, welcome, you're foreigners. We want to say welcome in Baghdad. Now, tell us your names and where you were from. And my stomach started to churn. I'm like, here we go. It's going to happen. I looked at the end of the line and I thought, well, it's all right for them. They were human shields from France and Germany, and their leaders opposed the war. So they were going to be the heroes. It's okay. So I looked at the end of the line and I said, you know, I reckon I've got about 30 seconds to conjure up the best New Zealand accent I can find. You know, I'm going to pretend I'm a Kiwi. Sweet as. So, you know, I'm hopeless at accents. By the time it got to me, Miss, what's your name? Where are you from? Took a deep breath. My name is Donna. I'm from Australia. You're from where? What did you say? I'm from Australia. Australia? Yeah, Australia. And then there's a couple of guys there, but he wanted to call his friend over. He said, hey, oi. Well, he didn't say oi. Yalla. Look, this one. She's from Australia. Australia's here. I thought, great, they're going to make a show of it. Great. Gathered a few friends around, looked back at me. He took my hand and shook it. He said, we love Australia. And I was like, oh, really? Yeah. And then I went, why? Oh, well, he said, we know Australia. We know what you're like because you watch your movies, you know, and they're really funny and you've got a great sense of humour and you're really nice people. You know, we've seen it, Crocodile Dundee. Yeah, we know. You're really funny. And you know what? That's what we're like too. You're just like us. We love to make jokes too. They made that connection. And I went, yeah, you're right. We are funny. Ah, now you mention it, yeah. And they said, oh, the other thing is sport. You're so good at sport. Every sport in the world, Australia's really good. And I went, yeah, you're right about that too. And they said, except for one. We're better. Can you guess? Soccer. Soccer/football. And they've got a pretty good team. And so that was it. I was a popular one then. I was popular because I was from Australia and my people are funny and good at sport. And that was great. I felt fantastic. Standing next to me though was Faith, a 70-year-old human shield from America. And I didn't know that she would have the same claims to make. And so they looked at her, Miss, what's your name? She said, my name is Faith, I'm from America. Oh, you're from where? Here we go. I'm from America, I'm from the United States. From America? You're from America? Hang on a minute, but your president, Mr. Bush, he says this about us and he says that about us, and the fighter planes are coming already over our houses and the ships are in the Gulf, and he said, does he know you're here? Did you tell him you were coming? Because remember, you're in Iraq and you don't challenge your president. That's the context of which they said that. And Faith said, you know what? I don't care what George Bush says because I've come here to be with you, my brothers and sisters in Iraq. And they took her hand and they said, you, Mrs. Faith, you are our most honoured guest. She knocked me off my perch. But that just goes to show from then on the relationship between us, all of us human shields, from whatever country we were from, was based on friendship, and the politics were barely mentioned in terms of us being there with them. And so as we went around meeting with these people, they had a message for us that was very clear in terms of the war, and that is thanks but no thanks, thank you very much. We've had war, they explained. We've lived with war. If you're 25, 30 years old in Iraq, all you would know would be basically a state of war, because of course, in the 80s, the long war that Iraq had with its neighbour Iran. And so that war was over borders and it was over land. And of course, Saddam Hussein was supported by the West with money, financial aid, military aid and political aid. And the Iraqi people resent that because before then, Saddam was on shaky ground. After that, the support of the West legitimised him and emboldened him. Thank you very much. And they're surprised that a lot of the Western journalists were totally unaware of that. So they feel you brought us Saddam, or you made him bigger than what he was. And so they said, we know what war is like. The war against Iran, okay, 8 years, bloodshed, horror, deaths, lots of loss of limbs, orphans, widows, destruction of the economy. And does anybody know how much land was gained in that dispute with Iraq? Does anybody know? 0. Not 1 centimetre changed in the borders between those two countries. So the Iraqi people look at those years of bloodshed and horror and they say that's the result. Then the 1991 Gulf War. So it was a bombing from the air and invasion from the south. And so from the air, the US forces destroyed the water treatment plants and the power stations and many other infrastructure. And so as a result, for the first time in Iraq's history, there was an epidemic levels of dysentery among children. You might have gathered when I spoke before, Iraq is not a third world country. Driving around that roundabout was the latest model Mercedes-Benz and BMW. It's a wealthy country, although there are the class layers that would be in any country. So there's the working classes, but the middle class is big and fat and well off. Now, don't let me paint too rosy a picture though, because of course we know the difference between life there and life here was living under Saddam. And to survive under Saddam, what you had to do was keep your mouth shut, because the difference was your freedom of speech. And if you opposed Saddam, you weren't able to speak, or there would be consequences. This is the story we know. So that's why I'm trying to tell the story that we didn't know. And so these people watched the decimation of Baghdad in the first Gulf War, and for years later they couldn't have safe, clean drinking water because the sanctions imposed on the country did not permit them to import chlorine, and so children were dying of dysentery, 250,000. And so they said, well, that's war as well. Okay, so we know the result of that. And then the sanctions, which they call the silent war. So they say, you know, we've had a bit of experience with war, been there, done that, thanks but no thanks. Can't you think of something else? Are you not smart enough? If indeed the issue is Saddam and human rights, and they kind of scoffed at that a bit. They're like, oh, you're interested now. 20 years too late, remember? You remember when Donald Rumsfeld came and shook hands, you know? They were very, understandably, they were very cynical because they knew the history which the Western media did not know.
That wasn't just a shaking of hands, it was almost orgasmic.
It was a hand over the shoulder of Saddam. It was very, very cosy. So, of course, we know the answer to their question, can't you think of something else? Isn't there another way? Of course there is, we know that. We know that. History has showed us that there is another way to depose dictators. And had this war not occurred, I believe the first country in the Arab Spring would have been the Iraqi people toppling Saddam Hussein. I believe that 100%. So that was their request of us. Now this picture is of a girl who I met in Baghdad Children's Hospital. That's dry blood that you see in her mouth, and she has a needle hanging out of her arm where that pool of blood is. Her name is Arian, and Arian is dying of leukemia. She wasn't on her own. As I walked through these hospital wards, there was about, I don't know, this day, 40, 50 children around her age or younger, skeletal, bald, sick, all dying of leukemia. You might think that's a lot. You bet it is. Dramatically more than most countries and most places.
What year is this?
This was 2003. The doctors explained why there were so many children dying of leukemia in Baghdad and in Iraq. And I heard that explanation. I came to the end of Arian's bed, I saw her and she looked at me, and when I heard why she was dying, I realised it was connected to me and my country and my system, the system I'm part of, and I just started to cry and cry and cry. It was quite overwhelming. Her father raced to get me a chair, her mother held my hand, and they gave me tissues and tried to comfort me. And I sat there and I was crying and crying, and of course what I'm talking about is the reason why Arian is dying was simply because of the bad luck of where she was born. And that is in the south of Iraq, city of Basra, which in 1991 suffered a catastrophe that will never be reversed. And that was the United States decided to experiment or use a new kind of weapon. Well, it wasn't really a new kind of weapon, it was a conventional weapon, but it was different because this weapon was either had at its core or alloyed using uranium. I call it depleted uranium. That's just because it's a byproduct of the nuclear energy cycle. So it's a waste product, so it's cheap. And also, depleted uranium is one of the densest, densest materials known. Tungsten is also one very good for weapons, but it's very expensive. Depleted uranium is almost as good and it's cheap. So it was widely used in 1991 Gulf War. Of course, we know uranium and human beings don't go together. So what happened was it was very effective. So the tank shells that were alloyed with depleted uranium would destroy an Iraqi tank as if it was made of cardboard because it erupts into fire upon penetration. It will destroy anything. They call it the bunker buster bombs you hear of. It's mostly depleted uranium. Just destroy. Very, very powerful. But depleted uranium remains in there as dust particles for about 500 years. It leaches into the, probably longer. It leaches into the soil and the water sources. So what you have is an environmental and human catastrophe forever. The first inkling we got of this catastrophe was when back in the US, the soldiers went home, and within a year, some started to get sick, and they developed cancers and tumours. Their wives started to miscarry, have stillborn babies and babies with birth deformities. They called it Gulf War syndrome. The US Department of Defence to this day refuses to test en masse veterans of the first Gulf War in 1991. If they did, they would have one of the largest class actions in history. To this day, those veterans are fighting for justice. Back in Iraq, times those thousands of soldiers by hundreds and hundreds of thousands because you had an entire community there, an entire ecosystem. And so most women now in Basra take probably 6 or 7 attempts to fall pregnant because they will miscarry that many times. Many children, many women won't come to full term or they'll give birth to stillborn baby. And then if a baby is born, probably at this stage it's 1/4, are born with such severe birth deformities, they barely look human. I've got photos of them. I wouldn't dream to show you. It's just too shocking. This is life now in Basra. If you have a child and they make it to the age of 10, they're considered a miracle. But that's when the leukemia sets in. So many of them will die by 12 or 13. Of course, leukemia can be treated. There are facilities and medicines available to treat leukemia in children, but the sanctions I mentioned before, it's a shame that we didn't know at the time how awful they were on the Iraqi people. The sanctions did not permit certain goods being permitted into the country that might be used to make a weapon. So you know what they banned? Paper clips and pens and paper, chlorine, as I said, so they couldn't clean the water, all types of chemicals, cleaning products, and medicines.
I remember that time.
Many.
They'd have people like going to see them and they'd say, these are just dupes for, Saddam's playing these people as being dupes, you know, going to see these kids, and it's all a setup, you know, and I remember at that time, you know,
yep.
people like you were dupes, you know,
through the,
by Saddam.
Well, yeah, people were trying to support the Iraqi people during these sanctions, during the 90s. And they were, some of them were arrested by the American government because they said it was treason. But the reason why Arian is dying is because she didn't have access to the medicines that she required, and same with the other children because of the sanctions, basic medicines. And so I'm sitting there crying knowing that my country was there in the first Gulf War. We were there. We have 2 Australian soldiers who had to do fundraising to have tests for uranium in their bodies, and both were found positive. I don't even know whether they're still alive now, but they had severe cancers, and the Australian government does not acknowledge this either. So we were there, and every year the United Nations human rights groups tried to beg the UN, because this was UN sanctions, tried to beg the UN to change the sanctions, to soften them or to let them go. They said this isn't hurting Saddam, it's hurting the ordinary people. And every year Australia put up its hand and said, no, we'll go again, we'll go again, we'll go again. So you could imagine how I felt. I felt somehow connected to the world that created that. And so I cried harder and I cried harder.
You're talking about the Australian connection in terms of our troops having been in the First World War, the First Gulf War. Do you know the source of the uranium that was used?
Oh,
was that Australian?
Look, it's hard to trace uranium that comes from Australia, but we could probably surmise reasonably safely that part of the uranium used would have definitely come from Australia. And that's another question for us. Thank you for raising that. That's what we need to also always remember that. So as I'm crying, you know, part of the reason why I was crying is not just because of what was happening to Arian, but what was happening within me. And what was happening inside of me was that I looked at her and I thought, all right, I reacted the same as any of you would. I wanted to help. I wanted to do something right then and there. And I realised for me to help, for me to do something, I needed to be at that point a doctor or a scientist. And I was neither. Great, I thought. Good on you, Donna. So what a great choice you made back at the end of year 12 when you decided to be a journalist. Yeah, good on you. Yeah, that's really helpful, isn't it? Great. And so this is what I was thinking, down on myself, great. And then I made the conclusion that we often come to sometimes, especially if we watch the news on a really bad night. God, that's awful. I wish there was something I could do, but there's nothing I can do. That's what I was saying. I wish there was something I can do, but there's nothing I can do. And you know the conclusion, the direct result of the statement, there's nothing I can do? You know what the direct result of that is? We do nothing. I wonder if that sometimes is convenient. Maybe it's an excuse. I sat there, and then Arian was watching me this whole time. You see, she had a bit of life left in her eyes. She was watching me the whole time. Then she did an amazing thing, and that she tried to speak. She tried to say something to me, to address me. And you know what? That dry blood in her mouth caused such pain. She was wincing as she was trying to get the words out. And so she stopped. But then she did another amazing thing. She reached out that bloated hand and she grabbed my arm. She grabbed my arm and she tugged on it. She squeezed it because she really wanted to tell me something. And to this day, I won't know exactly what she wanted to tell me, but we were holding this gaze that was very intense, and I feel the energy that was coming from her was very clear of what she was trying to say. And I think she was trying to say, come on now. You've been sitting there a while, crying. Hey, guess what? Not helping. What, you know, was doing nothing. Was achieving nothing. You know, sometimes our despair is a luxury. We need to grieve and we need to mourn injustice in the world and then pick ourselves back up again and say, all right, what can I do? Okay, Donna, I felt Arian gave me the invitation to ask, okay, Donna, you're not a doctor and you're not a scientist, get over it. Get over yourself, or take yourself more seriously. And so, you know, I sat there at the time, half an hour I had at her bed, I had lost all hope in myself and the world. And then somehow she brought it back again. This little Iraqi girl, body riddled with leukemia, invited me to be who I really am. What an amazing, amazing thing. So I went home that night and I thought, all right, Donna, what can you do? Okay, you're a journalist. Okay, so write. And so I'd learnt all about depleted uranium that day, and I hadn't known much beforehand. I wrote some articles. They were sent out on my email list and printed here and there. Okay, so keep writing. What else can you do? Okay, you've got a mouth. Some would say a big mouth, so you could tell the stories. And so since 2003, I've accepted every invitation to speak I've been given. And boy, am I tired. Because it's something I can do. And if it's something I can do, then I should be just doing it. Just not fussing about, just doing it. Throughout the time I was writing my book, it was after 2005, it took me a long time. I brought together the diaries from my time there, and I had to relive everything, and it really wasn't pleasant. I had a photo of Arian up there as inspiration for me to keep going, to remind me. Because in a way, I made a promise to her that day that I would take myself seriously and be who I'm called to be. And my book is dedicated to the memory of Arian. I'm returning to Iraq in a couple of months. I'm going to take this photo with me, and I have other photos of her and her family. And I'm going to go to Basra, and I want to find her family. So here's hoping. Here's hoping I will. And you know, this picture has a bigger lesson for us. And I remember a boy put up his hand at a school when I was speaking, and he said, Miss, at the end of the whole talk, he said, Miss, you know, I want to go and make a difference in the world too, and I want to do something, but I don't know if I can go over to a war zone and do what you do. I said, really? You don't think you could do that? He said, I'm sure I can't. I said, well, that's fantastic, because you probably know things that you could be doing. He said, sure, I can do this and that. I said, well, isn't that great? Because it would be probably unhelpful if everybody did the same thing. It would be kind of crowded in some places. So we don't need you to be doing that. I said, you don't need to do that. And I said, I'm not going to rouse on you if you don't decide to go and be an anti-war activist here or there, but I will rouse on you, I said, if you don't take the time to be in silence and stillness in that place where you connect with your own humanity and who you are, and you start to learn about what you can do. That's what we need to be doing. That whether that then makes you end up in your own neighbourhood, your own backyard, your own country, the issues ranging from anything, from children's issues, disabilities issues, Indigenous issues, asylum seekers, you name it. You know, there is a piece of social justice world like a jigsaw with your name on it. And if, I guess, we're not all doing what we're called to do, then we're all the poorer if we're not all sharing that piece. This is called Firdos Square, and it was the big roundabout, even though it's round, it's called a square, that was one of the earlier photos. It's the central of Baghdad, central place in Baghdad, and it's the sort of place where if there's going to be lots of people gather in one place, it will be Firdos Square. It's always crowded. It's like Town Hall in Sydney. If you're going to meet a friend, you meet at Town Hall steps. It's just always busy. And Saddam's statue here is a bit dusty. This is about the 5th day of the war. Poor Saddam's a bit dusty and looking a bit worse for wear. Of course, by I think the 4th of April or whatever day it was, that statue featured in news reports that went all over the world as a statue that came down. Now, what I'm going to say now is that the commentary that went with that event, when you saw some people at the bottom of the statue, you saw a tank with some Marines, and they had a chain around Saddam, and the tank in the end pulled the statue down. The commentary that went with that was mass jubilation on the streets of Baghdad. Saddam has fallen, the troops have come in, and there's jubilation and spontaneous. That actually didn't happen. Now, the fact that that didn't happen should leave you feeling pretty annoyed, because when we watch the media in good faith, we would expect that we would be given the full story, and that was not the full story. So I was still in the Middle East at that time, and many of my friends were there in that square, and the commentary that was given, that went out to CNN and the US and Australian networks, was given by a commentator who was sitting in an air-conditioned studio in Kuwait watching a video of the scene. So he wasn't there. The European networks showed something different and therefore reported something different. All you ever saw when you saw that statue and the foot of the statue and the people around it was a close-up. You probably won't remember now that that shot never panned out. But in other places it did. In other places it did. And there's a website, well, there's many, but one of the best ones is Information Clearinghouse, has a photo of the close-up shot that you saw and the wide shot together. When I first saw it, it took my breath away, and I thought, oh, damn you. How could you do that to us? Why? Because those two shots told a different story. Mass jubilation on the streets of Baghdad? Well, let me tell you what the wide shot showed. That huge big square was empty, but for about 50, maybe 80 people at the foot of the statue. There was tanks around the entrances to the roundabout, and they were guarding who was going in and out. About an hour earlier, before the cameras came, there was a pickup truck that came in with people on it from outside of the city area. We would call it a rent-a-crowd. In they came. A couple of those trucks contained people who'd been brought in from the US, former Iraqis who'd gone out, who came back. Many people don't even know that they came back on that day. This press event was conveniently located across the road from the Palestine and Sheraton hotels where the world's media were staying. So they just had to come out and walk across the road, and they were there. At one point, there were more Western journalists and cameramen in that square than there were Iraqi people. But you only ever saw the shot of the crowd. Many of those were Westerners. And so outside of the square, there were little small groups of Iraqis. And there was the European networks, as I said, told the different story. And the Arab networks as well told the fuller story. So there was a British BBC journalist who went and spoke to a small group, and there was a woman there wailing as if a Middle Eastern would at a funeral. You know, the kind of shrill sound they make. She was just doing this over and over and over again. And the journalist calmed her down and said, please, please, why are you crying like that? Why are you crying? And she looked at her like, what do you expect? For weeks now, they've bombed this city. I've lost so much. Our apartment building, it's falling to pieces. My friends, their children are in the hospital, and we've had no water, we have no power. What is our future now? What's going to happen? That might be what you would expect on this day, this shock. And so it was a wariness, it was a caution. Over in the square were people who were relieved, and that happened too. But that day was a complex mixture of those two feelings. And depending on where you were and where the cameras were different responses. But most people on that day were distraught and had no idea. Had foreign occupiers driving in tanks, playing Metallica songs and drinking beer. You know, and the Iraqis were just stunned. They just didn't know what to expect and what to think. And there was a man who grabbed a piece of cardboard and he wrote roughly with a pen, "Liberation, not occupation. Go home, US." That was that first day. And from then onwards, there was demonstrations held in that square every day. And at one point, they got up to about 10,000 people. This was about the 5th day after the occupation. I believe that you guys didn't even know that. Because when I got back, I asked my friends about it. How about those demonstrations? Can you believe they got organised so quickly? And they said, Donna, we don't know what you're talking about. It was very large because the Iraqi people are proud. And they said, all right, you've come. All right, you're here. We welcome strangers and we will give you hospitality, but we need you to go as soon as you can. You might not recall that it wasn't until 1 year after the occupation that the resistance began. In urgency, extremely violent. Because in those first few months, especially those first 9 months, the Iraqi people were polite. Because that's what they're like. And I said, all right, we'll give them a chance. But then the shootings, the problems, the Abu Ghraib, torture photos, all of that, and all bets were off. But the message about that statue is question everything you see in the media. Even if you're seeing it, question it if there is another angle, another shot, more to the story, just question that. And now we don't have to rely on the mainstream media because we can go to people who are there, blogging. If you want to know what's going on in Syria right now, you don't have to turn on Channel 7 News. Go onto Twitter or find a blog and you'll have a Syrian activist who's telling the story right now as we speak. So now we're really lucky to have that. So these shots are from the war. So this is just a residential neighbourhood with this car, which is incinerated. There would have been a family in that, and there would have been a family in probably the other 20 cars that were incinerated on this average residential street. It could have been downtown Bondi. This little girl's name is Rosul. She was going to have her arm amputated by the end of this day, and her father was distraught, thinking about her future. What's her future now? And she has a typical wound, and these wounds were the greatest cause of death in the war in Iraq, and that was shrapnel wounds. And that is because it was a war by the air, and the missiles were so strong and powerful. And Iraq was a city that was residential, so people lived in the city. So when they bombed, the Ministry for Health or whatever, it would be like an earthquake to a radius of about 10 kilometres. So your buildings would shake, your apartment buildings. Your windows would implode with such a velocity that the glass would embed into your body and slash your body right through. And we saw the x-rays, we saw the wounds of all of this. And of course, children and the elderly were the greatest victims, civilian victims, because I guess maybe they couldn't run fast enough or know what to do or how to respond. This little boy's name is Omar. His apartment block was near a missile strike and he had severe internal injuries. The nurses were very worried about him. And they said to us when they pulled us away from his bed, he's on his own now. We said, what do you mean? They said, well, he lost his mother, he lost his father, and he lost his 2 little brothers in the strike. That's his entire family. And we said, we haven't told him yet because we fear the shock will kill him. So towards the end, when they were talking about liberation and all this, I often thought of Omar. And thought, I wonder what he thinks of all this. I bet he just wants his family back. There were many, many stories like this. By far, women and children, the elderly, greatest victims of war. And this is a shot of a house, just a missile that came into a residential neighbourhood. And again, I found in the rubble lots of things that indicated the life of the families who lived there. It was very eerie walking through it. So I saw tennis rackets, DVD players, musical instruments, lots of children's toys, pet rabbits, and this little rag doll. I don't know, but this little rag doll just represented the innocence of the children who were the victims. And I couldn't help thinking if the little child who owned this little rag doll, because I think it was like a favourite. You know how you have a favourite blanket or something you hold on to? And I think this one was like that. So I wondered, where is the owner of this little rag doll now? Are they still alive? Do they still have their parents? When I returned to Iraq, it was to work with street kids and orphans who'd been dislocated as a result of the war. By far, one of the most serious problems after the invasion was the impact on children. 49% of Iraq's population is below the age of 16 in 2003. That meant that this war was essentially a war on kids. The incidences, 49% of Iraq's population is below the age of 16.
What year?
2003. It's probably lower now. Generally, countries that have had a long history of war would have similar statistics to that. A very young population. Afghanistan is similar, Martin, isn't it? Afghanistan is similar. Yeah, very similar. So these children are now, growing up with this very profound state of trauma. So we had child psychologists come to us and ask us, if you're going to do any work in Iraq, please work with the kids who are suffering trauma. And these are kids we found on the street, Hussein and Saif. They were carrying knives and weapons, and they had empty bullet shells, and they had razor wire between their knuckles. They were being chased during the night and harassed very much. They had to fight for food. We brought them into this shelter, and this day I was just so happy because they were playing with Lego. You might think, oh, big deal, they're playing with Lego, but when I first saw them, you would know why I was so happy. They were very, how do I say, challenging behaviour is a polite way to put it.
Sorry, what year was this now?
End of 2003 and into 2004. So November 2003 this would have been.
So that was a year after?
No, about 9 months. So remember March 2003. So this is November 2003.
I thought it was 2002.
No, 2003. Yeah, so we're in 9 years since. And so this is what we wanted to do, and that is calm the children down and remind them that they're just kids. They don't have to worry about, you know, the gathering food for themselves and everything. So when they were playing with the Lego, that's what kids should be doing. All they should be worried about is, does the red one fit the blue one and will it fit together? And if you give me the yellow, I'll swap you the orange. And play therapy is so healing, being in the present moment. We also did music, we did drama, and we did lots of sport with them to try to get these kids just to be innocent kids again. We also did a lot of drawing, and some of the images were quite very, very dramatic of what they were drawing. They were drawing what they'd witnessed. So bodies on the ground with pools of blood coming out. So they would have seen these things that they were drawing. So we raised money to set up a small aid group to work with these children. So we had a very small budget, but we were able to do a lot because we were all volunteers. So we were able to look after about 20 street kids and then put them into long-term accommodation. So Baghdad became, from the place of high culture and sophistication, a place that was just a mess and chaos. So missiles would have gone through buildings like this. This would have been, I think, the Ministry for Communication, and that missile would have contained depleted uranium as well. And so Baghdad is now seriously affected. This is a body of a man who had his head cut by the impact of a roadside bomb. I was almost standing next to him on this morning, except that I needed to have a shower before I went to get the milk. But that's what Iraq is like now. Iraq life today is that when you walk out the door, you don't know if you're going to make it home alive. Iraq now is in a state of anarchy and chaos. It's a basket case state. There is no democracy. You thought you couldn't speak out against Saddam? Oh my, don't speak out now. 2 days ago, I saw a report where there's about 10 people thrown into prison for trying to print a newspaper that challenged the government. Nah. You will end up in one of the underground torture chambers. Torture? You bet. You bet. It's a very divided, very violent, and very, very sad place. That place I described that was secular and free in terms of your personal life, how you wanted to live, it's gone. It's now a country run by clerics and mullahs. It has a religious government. And now the women can't dress the way I described before. Women were in positions of power. 51% of students at universities were women. It's all gone. Now women have to wear hijab. They don't have a choice. And so Iraqis, when I talk about Iraq, how I described it before, whenever I have Iraqis in the audience, they always say the same thing. They say, Donna, thanks so much for describing the way we used to live our life. They said, but remember now when you talk about Iraq, talk about it in the past tense. How sad is that? They said the place where I grew up and where I lived does not exist anymore, and they're absolutely right.
And it will take years to rebuild that.
Generations. So what you have now is America's worst nightmare. A theocracy, Islamist, fundamentalist government, oppressing the people without a democracy, and their best and favourite ally now, and the people funding, guess who? Iran. The enemy of the United States now is Iraq is a client state of Iran. Iran basically runs Iraq now. You couldn't even dream up the worst case scenario is what we have now. I'm just going to finish now with these pictures from Fallujah. But these are soldiers. People ask me a lot about soldiers. There's lots of stories. They're all very different. Most of the soldiers I met were very young from the United States, blacks or Hispanics, very poorly educated. And whenever I asked them, what are you doing here in Iraq? They'd say, oh, ma'am, just to get a job, ma'am, or to go to college, ma'am. And I'd go, no, I don't mean you personally. I mean, politically, why did you decide to be part of this? And I went, I don't know. I don't know what this is about. They said, I'm just scared. And they wanted to go home. Very traumatic for soldiers. And of course we know, listen to this statistic. This is shocking. There have been more soldiers die by their own hand, killing themselves, as veterans of the war in Iraq that died on the field. That is shocking. That's a recent statistic. Of course, you had other ones who were like this. This guy thought he was Rambo, thought he'd come off the set of Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. He had all the moves. He used to butt his machine gun in the backs of old ladies and children, and he used language that I would never repeat. But I find him a victim as well, because if you call people dogs and pigs, it means you've lost your humanity, because you can't recognise the humanity in the other. You've lost something very precious, very important, and that's the kind of man who struggles when they get home. So there's a lot of victims. So I'm going to finish off with Fallujah because that brings me into what I'm going to be doing in the next few months and year. This is an ambulance from Fallujah. It's a city west of Baghdad. It was described as a flashpoint, a hotbed of resistance. a place that was under attack in 2004 in a very intense attacks. That's bullet holes you see in the back of the ambulance, if you can see them well. I was living in Baghdad this time, April 2004. We got phone calls. The attacks at Fallujah had been going for about 2 or 3 days. We were very nervous about it. It was just awful. Fallujah was attacked because it was punished. You might remember some American contractors drove into Fallujah. They were kidnapped and killed. Their bodies were burnt and hung from a bridge. They were Blackwater contractors. We'd call them mercenaries. They were security contractors. That was beamed all across the United States, and there was demand for revenge and for punishment. So what happened next was truly shocking. They closed off the city. They didn't let anyone in or out. They closed it off to Western media as well, so there was very few eyewitnesses to what happened. We were phoned one day, we being a group of Western activists, human rights activists living together in Baghdad. Some doctors knew one of the British girls, Joanna, and he said, you call yourselves human shields, human rights monitors, whatever, you need to come to Fallujah because they're shooting us, the doctors, and they're shooting our children. And we said, hey, come on, settle down. Like, don't exaggerate, don't be over dramatic. You know, they can't shoot you, doctors and ambulances, and they can't shoot children. And they said, come and see. You need to come because we need you to help us because maybe they won't shoot you. It was a big decision to make. Imagine, this was under 24-hour bombardment. We were invited to go into that. Again, we asked the question, similar to my reflection. Someone's got to see this. Someone has to witness this, and someone has to tell the story. There were about 4 or 5 of us who decided that we had to be those. Who else was there? The Western media were not permitted, even though they wanted to go in, were not permitted. We said that we would go. We were smuggled in on the back of a truck, on back roads into Fallujah. We went to this place, which was a clinic, because Fallujah City Hospital had been closed down. No Iraqi person was permitted to be treated in Fallujah Hospital, only US forces. So the doctors had to set up clinics in back rooms and whatever. So this place where we were staying kept their blood in a Coke machine, and there was no anaesthetic, and they did their surgery by cigarette light. People would gather around and hold their cigarette lights up because there was no power. And at that stage, the method of attack was snipering. The instructions to the people of Fallujah was don't leave, don't move, or you'll be shot. Shoot anything that moves was the order given, and that's exactly what happened. So you had children coming in. This little boy has a gunshot wound to the head, and of course this little clinic's trying to cope with that, and they're doing their best. But under those conditions, he doesn't have a chance and he's gone. That was about the 10th one on that day. You can see the blood on this woman's scarf. Here's a little girl. There's another body. None of these are fighters. And I'll finish with this one. I don't know about you, but I find this pretty shocking, this photo. It's a little girl wearing pink, holding that Kalashnikov a little bit too comfortable for my liking. She's standing outside the clinic this day, and I looked at that anger in her eyes and I took this photo. And there was some Iraqi women standing nearby, and they called me over and they said, Miss, they had broken English, but I understood what they said. They said, Miss, you think this is interesting, do you? You want to take a photo? Think this is interesting to take a picture? I said, you know what? I find this really disturbing. Yeah, I think this is shocking. This is disturbing. She's a little girl. She'll be holding a tennis racket or a doll. She's holding a gun. They said, oh, you think that's disturbing, do you? I said, yes. They said, you know what we think is disturbing? We think it's disturbing that you come from a country, a culture, a place, where your people think it's okay to kill children. That's your culture, it's your belief. You think it's okay to kill children. I said, hey, hang on a minute. I said, that's not true. I said, I don't come from a place, my people don't believe it's okay to kill children, it's just not true. And one woman said, okay, let me rephrase. You come from a place where your people think it's okay to kill our children. What could I say? The bodies were at my feet. A dozen. Just that day, that morning. They had to dig up Fallujah soccer field because the cemetery had overflowed, and we were only in the first week. I was one of only 5 eyewitnesses to see this. A French camera crew also got smuggled in, and there were 4 of us. 6. We were shot at as well. We took the ambulance. We went onto the street, we held up our passports. I had 4 bullets shaved the top of my head. The people of Fallujah ended up as refugees on soccer fields in Baghdad. The second attack finished off the city, and guess what happened during those 2 attacks? They used depleted uranium all over again. They hadn't learnt from the first occasion. Now in Fallujah, if you're a woman, the advice given to you is don't even try. You will not give birth to a healthy child. The babies coming out of Fallujah Hospital each day, again, are shocking. A whole generation of women will never be mothers to a healthy child. And a whole generation of little human beings will never be born to a full life. With the girl, the women said to me, let me tell you her story. So her story is, they said, on about day 2 or day 3, her father went out onto the street and he was shot by a sniper. They said they don't know why he went, it was silly. He was a pharmacist. Perhaps he thought he could help somebody. His wife watched, and everyone in the neighbourhood were watching out their windows. His wife went on to try to drag her body out. She was shot through the head and her body slumped over his. The bodies were taken away. The neighbours went into her house. This little girl has siblings, aged 3 and 2. And the neighbours came in and said, you are now the head of your household. They gave her the gun and they taught her how to use it. So this little girl is holding this Kalashnikov to protect herself from us. That's what's shocking about that photo. That we went there. You know, there was an Australian Major General, his name is Jim Mulhearn, who was the operational manager of the attacks on Fallujah. We were there. You know, I think about this little girl often. I wonder what she's done with the anger in her eyes. Has she processed it? Did she get help? How did she go raising? I hope there was family that could have helped her. Or did she go and join a militant group? Again, this cycle of violence. When we get to the stage when we've got little girls holding guns like that, I think it's about time we can say, okay, enough's enough, that's it, come on. But this is war. This is what happens, it's not polite. I did my master's dissertation on the attacks on Fallujah and noted 75 breaches of the Geneva Conventions. There's no rules. Don't think the soldiers are sitting there going, we can't shoot at civilians, oh, we better not. Nah. You know, the WikiLeaks video where they showed the gunships, I'm sorry if you think that that was a big event. That was a common event. We only got the footage from that one. There's probably another 3 that I've got footage of, but that was common. It was a standard procedure. War kills children and mothers and causes babies not to have a life. And we're talking about the sacredness of motherhood. This is the result, and also the toxic legacy that it leaves behind. So I think we can think back to the non-violent solutions we talked about before, and we think it's about time that we take that a bit more seriously. And again, this is our tradition and this is our teaching. Love your enemies. So my mission in the next few months is to go back to Fallujah. It's a city under checkpoints still. It's still very dangerous, but I want to get in there and go to the hospital. And I want to humanise the story of what's happening with the babies. I want to give faces and names to them, and then raise awareness with a documentary and by writing about it. So I have a flyer over there which talks about the Australian campaign to ban uranium weapons, because there's an international campaign to ban these weapons for good, so that this can never happen again. There was a vote that went to the United Nations 2 years ago as a warm-up resolution just about the transparency and that countries had to name where they'd use them. 148 countries voted in favour, as you would. Why not? Of course you would.
In favour of banning?
Of greater transparency, so that countries who use them have to declare where they've used them so that communities know. They don't grow the tomatoes there, they don't use the water, they've got to move away. That's all it was asking. It wasn't very threatening. So 148 countries voted in favour, 4 voted against, and 4 or 5, because they are the countries that use or make depleted uranium weapons. The United States, England, France, Russia and Israel. Australia abstained. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to look the Foreign Minister in the eye and say, you explain that to me.
So they didn't vote either way?
No. They should have voted yes, of course, because in order for them to honour their other conventions that they've signed, they need to support human rights and greater transparency and rights of these communities. And so the goal of the Australian community is to change the abstention to a yes vote. And there's another vote in October this year, and so we're trying to get that, to bring a yes vote to New York. And I hope to go to New York and be part of the lobbying for that vote in October. And I hope by then, before then, I would have lobbied Australian members of Parliament to make sure we send a yes vote. My books and CDs are over there because, of course, I need to fundraise. So if you're interested, that's what that's for. The CD's got some amazing and wonderful anti-war songs on it we made for the Pine Gap court case. It's a wonderful CD, in my book as well. Happy to sign it. So,
I think I was going to ask you a question about Pine Gap, and you came out with all of that. It's incredible.
Yeah. So I'll finish up there, guys. Thank you very much. And if you want to ask some questions, we have 5 minutes for questions.